The grand equinox was the beating heart of the Dawn Court, a night when the brutal winter was banished by the sheer will of the Alpha King, and the sacred magic of his Luna. The grand hall was a cavern of obsidian pillars and vaulted stone ceilings, but tonight it felt like the inside of a furnace. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, their bodies generating a suffocating heat, their eyes fixed on the raised dais at the end of the grand hall. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the heavy, electric anticipation of the bonding ceremony. The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it would become the night. The Eastern Pack sealed its own frozen doom. Seraphina Solis stood at the center of the dais. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. The Dawn Court mantle hung heavily upon her shoulders, a massive cloak of crimson velvet trimmed with the white fur of winter wolves. It was a physical manifestation of her duty, a suffocating weight that symbolized her absolute submission to the Alpha King and her eternal vow to protect his people. Beneath the mantle, her blood hummed with a quiet, ancient resonance. She was a carrier of the ancient solar magic, a dormant, hidden bloodline that thrived on true appreciation and devotion. For 5 years, she had silently bled her sacred magic into the soil of the kingdom, ensuring their crops grew, their winters remained mild, and their children did not freeze in their beds. She had asked for no recognition. She had only asked for her mate. Vayne Ashwood, the Alpha King of the Dawn Court, was late. The massive oak doors at the entrance remained firmly shut. The murmurs of the nobility began to rise, a low buzzing sound that crawled up the stone walls. Seraphina did not fidget. She did not look toward the doors. She simply focused on her own breathing, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart. Beside her stood Garrick Ironclaw, the high priest of the pack. The old wolf held the equinox torch in his gnarled hands, the sacred firebrand unlit, waiting for the Alpha King to ignite it and pass it to his Luna. Garrick shifted his weight, his eyes darting nervously toward the entrance. He knew something was wrong. The entire pack knew something was wrong, but no one dared to speak it aloud. Then, the heavy oak doors exploded inward. The sound echoed through the hall like a thunderclap, instantly silencing the murmurs. The crowd parted like a wounded sea, stepping back, bowing their heads, exposing the long carpet of ash-grey velvet that led to the dais. Vayne Ashwood strode into the hall. He was a vision of terrifying, arrogant power. His broad shoulders were draped in black leather and gold armor, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed straight ahead, completely bypassing Seraphina. But it was not his imposing figure that caused the collective breath of the assembled crowd to hitch. It was the woman clinging to his arm, Lyra Moonbrook. She was an Omega from the Outer Territories, a woman with no magic, no title, and no claim to the throne. But she possessed a delicate, fragile beauty that made men want to bleed for her. She wore a gown of spun silver that clung to her curves, her large doe eyes wide with a perfectly practiced expression of overwhelming innocence. She leaned into Vayne, her fingers gripping his forearm as if she were terrified of the crowd, as if he were her only shield against a cruel world. And Vayne looked down at her with a protective fury that Seraphina had never, not once in 5 years, seen directed at herself. Seraphina didn't know the Alpha King's mind had been poisoned by false promises and sweet, manipulative whispers in the dark. She didn't know Lyra had spent the last 3 months convincing Vayne that the pack's prosperity came solely from his own alpha strength, not from the silent sacrifices of a seemingly ordinary Luna. And she definitely didn't know that the laws of the ancient magic were about to be broken in front of the entire kingdom. All she knew was the sudden, violent plummet of temperature in her chest. The mate bond, the golden thread that had anchored her soul to Vane's since they were children, began to freeze. Vane led Lyra up the steps of the dais. He stopped 3 paces away from Seraphina. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Garrick Ironclaw's hands shook so violently that the heavy iron of the Equinox torch rattled against his rings. The priest looked at Vane, then at Seraphina, his face pale with a terrifying realization. He was a traditionalist bound by law, observant enough to see the catastrophe unfolding, but far too cowardly to challenge the Alpha King's disastrous decisions. "Speak the words," Vane commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. It was the voice of a king who believed he was untouchable, a man who thought he could rewrite destiny by sheer force of will. Garrick swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet hall. "My king, the rites of the equinox demand that the sacred flame be passed to the true Luna, the one who wears the mantle, the one chosen by the goddess." Vane's stormy eyes finally snapped to Seraphina. There was no warmth in them. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no remorse. There was only the cold, calculated judgment of a man who had weighed her value and found it lacking. He looked at the heavy Dawn Court mantle on her shoulders as if it were an insult to his reign. "The goddess does not dictate who stands beside me," Vane sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I am the Alpha King. I choose the mother of this pack. I choose the one who brings light to my shadows." He reached out and snatched the Equinox torch from Garrick's trembling hands. The old priest gasped, stumbling back, but Vane did not look at him. Vane turned his back on Seraphina entirely. He turned to the fragile woman, clinging to his arm. Lyra looked up at him, her lips parted in a soft, triumphant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Vane plunged the tip of the torch into the eternal braziers burning at the edge of the dais. The flame caught, roaring to life, casting violent, flickering shadows across his harsh features. He lifted the burning brand and held it out, not to his fated mate, but to his lover. "I, Vane Ashwood, name Lyra Moonbrook as the true heart of the Dawn Court," he declared, his words thundering through the hall. "With this flame I bind my reign to hers." Lyra reached out with delicate, trembling fingers and took the torch. The moment her skin touched the sacred iron, the mate bond inside Seraphina's chest snapped. It did not break cleanly. It shattered like a pane of storm glass hit by a hammer, sending a shockwave of agonizing, blinding ice through her veins. The physical pain was so intense that her vision went entirely white. A hollow ache ripped open in her sternum, a void where a soul used to be. For a fraction of a second, the universe held its breath, waiting for the Luna to scream, waiting for her to collapse to the floor, to tear at her hair, to beg her Alpha King not to cast her aside into the endless winter. But Seraphina did not scream, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. As her vision cleared, she saw the faces of the nobility staring up at her. Some looked horrified. Most looked pitying. They expected tears. They expected a hysterical, desperate display of a woman losing her crown and her mate in the same breath. There were no tears. Her eyes were completely dry, burning with a quiet, terrifying clarity. The humiliation was absolute, a public execution of her dignity, but as the golden thread of the bond dissolved into freezing dust, she realized something else. She was free. The heavy, suffocating weight of Vane's expectations, the endless years of bleeding her sacred magic into his ungrateful soil, the constant, draining effort to make herself small so his ego could remain large, it was gone. The void in her chest was cold, but it was hers. Silence. The entire court watched as Seraphina slowly raised her hands. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, devoid of any trembling. She reached up to her collarbones, her fingers finding the heavy golden clasps of the Dawn Court mantle. The metal was warm from her skin. She unfastened the left clasp with a sharp, definitive click. Then the right. Vane turned his head slightly, his brow furrowing as he heard the sound. Lyra blinked, the triumphant smile faltering on her lips as she realized the displaced Luna was not dissolving into a puddle of misery. Seraphina let the heavy crimson velvet slide from her shoulders. She didn't catch it. She let it fall. The massive cloak hit the stone floor with a soft, suffocating thud, pooling directly into the grey ashes of the unlit ceremonial hearth at the edge of the dais. The pristine white fur was instantly stained with soot. Garrick let out a strangled gasp, stepping forward as if to save the sacred garment, but froze when Seraphina's eyes met his. Her gaze was no longer the soft, enduring amber of a submissive Luna. It was the colour of liquid fire, a burning, absolute gold that pinned the priest to the floor. She turned her gaze to Vayne. The Alpha King stood rigid, the torch still burning in Lyra's hands, his stormy eyes suddenly uncertain. He had expected her to fight for him. He had expected her to drop to her knees. He had wanted the validation of her desperation to prove to his court that he was the ultimate prize. Instead, Seraphina gathered the skirts of her simple underslip, the fabric stripped of its royal colours. She lowered herself into a curtsy. It was flawless. It was a masterclass in physical control, her spine perfectly straight, her head bowed just enough to signify the end of a transaction, but not a fraction of an inch more. It was the curtsy of a sovereign acknowledging a stranger. She held it for exactly 1 second. Then she stood. She turned her back on the Alpha King, on the fragile mistress holding a stolen flame, on the cowardly priest, and on the hundreds of silent wolves who had watched her bleed for them for half a decade. She walked down the steps of the dais. The crowd scrambled backward, a wave of bodies parting wildly to create a wide, empty path toward the heavy oak doors. No one dared to breathe. The sound of her soft leather boots against the stone was the only noise in the cavernous hall. Footfall after footfall. The rhythm was steady, unbroken, the marching drum of a woman walking out of her own grave. Seraphina? Vayne's voice cracked like a whip behind her. It wasn't an order. It was a question, edged with a sudden, inexplicable panic. The Alpha King was suddenly realizing that the script he had written in his head was unraveling. She did not stop. She did not hesitate, and most importantly, she never looked back. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, and tonight she was taking her name back. She reached the massive oak doors, pushing them open with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a woman so small. The cold night air of the equinox rushed in, violently swirling around her, extinguishing the torches by the entrance. She stepped over the threshold, and the heavy doors slammed shut behind her, a sound like a tomb ceiling closed. Within 60 seconds, she was in the royal stables. The stable master, unaware of the catastrophe in the royal hall, quickly brought out her mare. Seraphina mounted the horse, her body running on pure, icy instinct. She rode out of the capital gates as the midnight bell began to toll. The moment her horse's hooves crossed the boundary line of the kingdom, the atmosphere fractured. The ancient magic that had been woven into the very bedrock of her former homeland, the sacred, warming power that had kept the rivers flowing and the crops blooming in the dead of winter, sensed the departure of its master. It snapped back to her. It ripped out of the soil, out of the stones, out of the air itself, rushing back into Seraphina's veins like a returning tide. Behind her, the temperature in the abandoned territory plummeted 30 degrees in a matter of seconds. The frost, which had been held at bay for 5 years, immediately began to crawl up the obsidian pillars of the cavernous room. Vayne Ashwood and his new lover were about to learn that a stolen torch could not keep a kingdom warm when the sun itself had walked away. But Seraphina did not care. She dug her heels into her horse's flanks and rode north. 3 days passed. The journey to the Obsidian Empire took 3 days of brutal, unforgiving travel. Seraphina rode until her horse could go no further, leaving the exhausted animal at a neutral way station with her last silver coin. From there, she walked. She walked into the frostfall peaks, the jagged, towering mountain range that separated the dying warmth of Vane's lands from the eternal, magical winter of Emperor Silas Thorn's domain. The cold here was not like the artificial chill of Vane's betrayal. It was honest. It was a primal, ancient cold that demanded respect. The wind howled through the narrow mountain passes, tearing at her thin underslip, biting into her skin like physical claws. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her fingers blue, her silver-white hair frozen into sharp icicles around her face. The physical toll was catastrophic, but her mind was completely silent. There was no grief left. The freezing of the mate bond had hollowed her out, leaving only a cavern of survival instinct. She was a vessel of dormant fire, trapped in a shell of ice. By the evening of the third day, the blizzard grew blinding. The snow fell in heavy, violent sheets, erasing the path ahead, erasing the sky, erasing the world. Seraphina's boots dragged through drifts that reached her thighs. Her muscles screamed in agony, her lungs burning with every breath of razor-sharp air. Unbeknownst to her, she had already crossed the border into a land that tolerated no trespassers. She remained unaware of the Emperor's personal patrols or the lethal nature of the cursed predator who ruled these peaks. Her foot caught on a jagged root hidden beneath the snow. Seraphina fell. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her bones. She tried to push herself up, her frozen fingers digging into the ice, but her arms simply gave out. Her cheek rested against the snow. It felt almost warm now, a dangerous, deceptive comfort creeping into her brain. The darkness began to claim the edges of her vision. The howling wind seemed to quiet down, fading into a dull, rhythmic roar. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, just to rest. The earth beneath her violently trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a localized, terrifying pressure, a heavy, suffocating aura that crushed the breath from her lungs. The blizzard around her seemed to freeze in mid-air, the snowflakes hovering completely motionless, as if nature itself was terrified to move. The temperature dropped even further, plunging into an abyssal, unnatural cold. The scent of pine and roasted meats from her past was violently overwritten by the smell of ozone, crushed ice, and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Then he spoke. The voice did not come from the air. It thundered directly through the frozen void in her chest, a sound so deep and resonant it vibrated in her marrow. Open your eyes. Seraphina's eyelashes fluttered, breaking the ice that had formed on them. Through the hazy white veil of the storm, a massive shadow loomed over her. It was a man, impossibly tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the meager light of the moon. He wore armor forged from black ice, and a heavy cloak of shadow wolf fur whipped wildly in the wind behind him. Emperor Silas Thorn, the lethal ruler of the Obsidian Empire, a man known to slaughter entire battalions for crossing a single foot over his borders. A king who ruled through absolute terror, cursed with a touch so cold it stopped the hearts of his enemies. He knelt beside her in the snow. Seraphina could not move. She could only stare up at his face. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, his skin pale as marble, but his eyes were not the stormy, arrogant grey of her past. They were a burning, radiant amber, like molten gold, like the sun. Silas looked down at the freezing, half-dead woman in his snow. He saw the bruises on her soul, the shattered remnants of a rejected bond, the utter, devastating dignity in her exhausted expression. He didn't see a broken Omega. He saw a queen who had survived the slaughter. Slowly, carefully, as if she were made of spun glass, the most dangerous man in the world reached out. He stripped off his heavy leather gauntlet, exposing his bare skin. Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening, as he anticipated the curse of his own freezing touch harming her, but he touched her anyway. His bare fingers brushed against her frozen cheek. The moment his skin made contact with hers, the world exploded. There was no pain, there was no freezing death. Instead, a shockwave of pure, blinding heat erupted from the point of contact, tearing through Serafina's veins like a river of liquid silver. The dormant solar magic inside her blood, which had been waiting for a catalyst, waiting for someone who was truly worthy of its light, roared to life. The ice on her skin evaporated instantly into steam. The terrible, hollow ache in her chest, the void left by Vane's betrayal, was violently filled with a rushing, roaring warmth. The golden thread of a true mate bond, hidden by the goddess until this exact moment, snapped into place like a key turning in an ancient lock. Silas gasped a harsh, ragged sound, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. But he couldn't break the connection. The magic tethered them together, wrapping around his cursed, freezing soul and pouring absolute, unconditional sunlight into his darkness. He looked at his own hand, then down at Serafina, his molten gold eyes cracking open with an emotion so raw, so violently possessive, it made the very mountains tremble. He had wandered a frozen desert for 30 years, and he had finally found water. Silas leaned down, his face inches from hers. The blizzard around them began to melt, the snow turning to warm spring's rain in a 10-foot radius around their bodies. He slipped his massive arms under her shoulders and behind her knees, lifting her from the freezing ground with a gentleness that completely betrayed his terrifying reputation. He held her against his chest, tucking her head beneath his chin, shielding her entirely from the elements. The word thundered through their new bond like a war drum, echoing with a protective fury that promised absolute annihilation to anyone who ever dared to make her feel small again. Mine. The blistering heat radiating from the Emperor's chest was a stark contrast to the lethal blizzard, tearing through the northern mountains. Serafina lay motionless against his armor, her cheek resting over the heavy thud of his heart. The golden thread of their newly awakened mate bond pulsed with every step he took, a steady, rhythmic surge of liquid fire that actively chased the frostbite from her veins. The wind howled around them, a deafening roar of ice and fury that sought to rip her from his grasp, but Silas's arms were an impenetrable fortress. He had wrapped his massive shadow wolf cloak entirely around her trembling frame, creating a shadowed, suffocatingly warm cocoon that smelled sharply of crushed ice, ancient pine, and the deep electric scent of an apex predator. She did not close her eyes immediately. Through the narrow gap in the heavy fur collar, the fallen Luna watched the jagged, frozen landscape blur past them. Her body was broken, her muscles torn and screaming from 3 days of relentless marching, but her mind was razor-sharp. She had crossed the border. She had deliberately chosen the deadliest terrain on the continent, fully aware that the Obsidian Empire tolerated no trespassers. The legends painted Emperor Silas as a monster, a king forged from dark ice, who slaughtered without mercy. Yet, as she felt the careful, almost reverent way his massive hands supported her spine, Serafina knew she had made the only acceptable choice. She would rather freeze to death on the edge of a tyrant's blade than return to the toxic, suffocating humiliation of the pack she had left behind. She had accepted her exile. She had walked away in silence now, wrapped in the arms of the most dangerous man alive. The hollow void in her sternum finally began to close. The journey through the deepest part of the mountain pass was a blur of sensory extremes. The air grew thinner, the cold outside the cloak becoming so profound it caused the surrounding pine trees to splinter and crack under the pressure. Yet, inside the cocoon, the dormant ancient magic in Serafina's blood continued to rise, answering the call of the Emperor's cursed, freezing soul. It was a symbiotic exchange of raw power. Her solar lineage poured warmth into his icy core, while his unyielding strength grounded her, providing the ultimate physical shield against a world that had tried to break her. For the first time in 5 years, she did not have to make herself small. She did not have to suppress her inner light to stroke a fragile male ego. The realization brought a strange, heavy exhaustion crashing down upon her. Her breathing slowed, matching the cadence of his boots crunching through the deep snow, and the darkness of sleep finally claimed her, miles away. Far beneath the towering northern peaks, the consequences of her silent departure were unfolding with catastrophic speed. The royal cavern of the Eastern Pack had been a furnace of celebration, a chaotic sea of cheering nobility, spiced wine, and the triumphant laughter of an alpha king who believed he had conquered destiny. But the illusion of his supremacy shattered less than an hour after the midnight bell had tolled. It began at the altar. The Equinox torch, the sacred iron brand that Vayne had so arrogantly plunged into the eternal braziers and handed to his fragile mistress, began to flicker. Lyra stood beside the Alpha King, her delicate fingers wrapped around the heavy iron handle, her doe eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced look of modest royalty. She wore the silver gown like a second skin, basking in the adoration of the pack. But then, the roaring flame at the tip of the torch suddenly turned a sickly, pale blue. It sputtered, coughing out a thick cloud of acrid smoke. Lyra gasped, coughing as the ash hit her face, her grip loosening on the metal. Before anyone could react, the sacred flame died. It did not burn down to the wood. It did not fade gradually. It was extinguished instantly, as if a massive, invisible hand had snuffed it out. Vayne frowned, his stormy eyes narrowing in irritation. He stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the dais, and reached for the torch. "Bring another brand," he commanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a ruler who despised interruptions. "The oil is tainted. Replace it immediately." But Garrick Ironclaw did not move. The old priest stood frozen at the edge of the dais, his gnarled hands trembling uncontrollably as he stared, not at the dead torch, but at the stone floor beneath his feet. "My king," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried through the sudden, eerie silence of the hall. "It is not the oil." A sharp, high-pitched cracking sound echoed from the far corners of the obsidian room. The nobility turned in unison, their breath suddenly visible in the air, thick plumes of white mist billowing from their mouths. The temperature inside the grand cavern was plummeting at an unnatural rate. It was not a gradual chill, it was a physical assault. The heat generated by hundreds of bodies was entirely devoured by an encroaching, abyssal cold. A thin layer of frost began to materialize on the soaring stone pillars. It crawled up the rock like a living, venomous web, spreading across the vaulted ceilings and descending the walls. The golden goblets resting on the long banquet tables frosted over in seconds, the warm spiced wine inside them freezing so rapidly that the metal cups warped and split with loud metallic snaps. Lyra shivered uncontrollably, her bare shoulders turning a sickly shade of blue. She dropped the dead torch, the heavy iron clattering uselessly against the stone, and desperately pressed herself against Vayne's chest. "Vayne!" she whimpered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "It is cold. Make it stop." The Alpha King stared at the creeping ice, a deep primal panic clawing at the edges of his arrogance. He pushed his mistress aside with a rough, distracted motion, ignoring her cry of protest. He closed his eyes, digging deep into his chest, calling upon the raw, dominant power of his alpha blood. He roared, a deafening, feral sound that shook the very foundations of the palace, attempting to force his will upon the environment, to command the warmth to return through sheer physical dominance. The frost simply ignored him. It crept over his boots, chilling the leather, biting into his ankles. It encased the grand braziers, turning the glowing red coals into dead stones. The power that had sustained the Dawn Court, the ancient, nurturing warmth that Vane had convinced himself belonged to him, was completely gone. "The ward is broken," Garrick whispered, dropping to his knees on the freezing floor, his head bowed in utter despair. "The solar magic has left the territory. You drove the light away, my king, and now we will all die in the dark." Vane's eyes snapped open, his pupils blown wide with a mixture of dread and furious denial. He turned on his heel, his heavy cape sweeping behind him, and ran toward the massive balcony that overlooked the agricultural heart of his kingdom. He threw open the glass doors, stepping out into the biting night air. The sight before him was an apocalypse. The lush, rolling valleys of his domain, the endless acres of winter wheat, and blooming orchards that had made his pack the wealthiest in the southern hemisphere, were dying before his eyes. A massive, unnatural blizzard was rolling down from the northern borders, an avalanche of white death, swallowing the green fields. He could hear the distant, horrifying sound of ancient riverbeds freezing solid, the water turning to thick, impenetrable ice in a matter of minutes. The crops were snapping under the weight of the sudden frost, a continent-wide harvest, obliterated in the span of a single hour. He gripped the stone balustrade, the rough rock freezing beneath his bare hands. The reality of his colossal arrogance finally crashed down upon him, a suffocating weight that drove the breath from his lungs. He had traded a goddess for a fragile trinket. He had stripped the crown from the only woman who possessed the power to keep his people alive, humiliated her in front of the entire kingdom, and allowed her to walk away into the night. He stared out at the encroaching blizzard, the wind tearing at his face. Only now did he realize he had watched her leave, like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest, and he had done nothing to stop it. The kingdom of the dawn was dead, and he had struck the fatal blow himself. Far to the north, beyond the reach of Vane's desperate, freezing kingdom, the Emperor's keep loomed against the night sky. It was a fortress carved directly from the heart of a glacier, a monument to the lethal power of the northern realm. Colossal spires of dark ice and stone pierced the heavy storm clouds, while massive iron gates guarded the entrance, flanked by elite sentinels who stood as motionless as statues in the freezing wind. When Silas Thorne emerged from the blizzard, carrying the unconscious woman in his arms, the heavy silence of the courtyard was broken only by the sound of weapons dropping. The heavily armored guards, men who had fought in 100 blood-soaked campaigns and feared nothing, stared in stunned disbelief. Their lethal, untouchable sovereign, a man whose cursed skin froze the blood of anyone he touched, was holding a fragile, silver-haired female. And he was not wearing his gauntlets. Silas did not bark orders. He did not explain himself. He simply strode through the massive iron gates, his golden eyes blazing with a protective intensity that dared anyone to question his burden. His jaw was locked tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors of his fortress. The interior of the keep was an architectural masterpiece of winter, vast halls of polished obsidian lit by pale, cold witchlight. The air was perpetually freezing, a reflection of the Emperor's cursed soul. But as Silas carried Seraphina deeper into the fortress, the temperature immediately surrounding them remained impossibly warm. Her dormant magic was a radiant shield, bleeding into his armor, soothing the agonizing, decades-long ache in his bones. He bypassed the grand healing wards entirely, refusing to let his military doctors near her. He carried her up the sweeping spiral staircase to the highest tower, directly into his own private sanctum. The Emperor's chambers were vast and austere, devoid of any soft comforts or luxury, a stark reflection of a man who believed he deserved nothing but the cold. A massive bed carved from dark iron sat in the center of the room, draped in heavy, thick furs of shadow wolves and snow bears. Silas approached the bed and slowly, painstakingly, lowered her onto the mattress. The moment her weight left his arms, a sharp, physical pain lanced through his chest, a harsh protest from his newly awakened wolf demanding he pull her back against his skin. He grit his teeth, forcing his primal instincts into submission. He was a monster to the world, but he would not be a monster to her. He stepped back, putting 3 feet of necessary distance between them. He watched as her pale face sank into the dark furs, her breathing slow and even. Her silver-white hair spilled across the pillows like moonlight on dark water. The bruising around her wrists, the subtle signs of long-term emotional starvation and neglect, were painfully obvious under the pale light of the chamber. A low, dangerous growl vibrated in the back of his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated murder, directed at the men who had dared to dim her light. Silas did not leave the room. He pulled a heavy oak chair to the side of the bed, sat down, and waited. He would stand guard over her rest if it took a century. When Seraphina finally woke, there was no sudden jolt of panic. She drifted upward from the depths of her exhaustion, slowly, her senses returning one by one. The first thing she registered was the overwhelming sensation of physical safety. She was not shivering. The bone-deep ache in her muscles had dulled to a distant throb. She felt the heavy, incredibly soft weight of a massive fur pelt draped over her body, trapping a heat that smelled distinctly of cedar, smoke, and that same electric ozone she had encountered in the blizzard. She opened her eyes. The room was bathed in the pale, soft light of early morning, reflecting off the snow outside. The stone walls were dark, the architecture severe, but the atmosphere was entirely still. She turned her head slowly against the pillow. Silas was sitting exactly where he had been for the last 14 hours. The Sovereign of the North had not removed his armor. His dark cape was thrown over the back of the chair, his broad shoulders filling the space entirely. He sat perfectly still, his massive hands resting on his knees, his molten gold eyes tracking her every movement with unwavering focus. Yet, despite his intimidating size and the lethal reputation attached to his name, he made no move to crowd her. He remained seated, offering her the ultimate respect of physical space. Seraphina blinked, her mind piecing together the fractured memories of the blizzard, the crushing pressure of the cold, and the blinding explosion of heat when his bare hand had touched her cheek. She felt the golden thread of the mate bond resting comfortably in her chest, a steady, warm connection that waited patiently for her acknowledgement. She slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position, pulling the heavy fur up to her collarbones. She kept her spine straight, the ingrained discipline of a Luna refusing to let her cower, even in the bed of a tyrant. "You are in my empire," Silas said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and settled directly into her marrow. It was not a voice used to speaking gently, yet he carefully modulated the volume, ensuring the sound did not startle her. "I know where I am," Seraphina replied, her own voice slightly hoarse from the cold, but steady. She looked directly into his golden eyes, refusing to look away. "I crossed your borders intentionally." Silas's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, the dark ice armor shifting with a soft, grinding sound. "My patrols have standing orders to execute anyone who sets foot in the northern mountains. If I had not felt the shift in the atmosphere, if my beast had not torn down the gates to reach the pass, you would be a frozen corpse buried under 10 feet of snow." "If I had stayed in the Dawn Court," she answered quietly, her amber eyes hardening into a cold, unbreakable glaze, "I would be a living corpse buried under a lifetime of humiliation. I made my choice. Emperor, I would rather die on my feet in your winter than live on my knees in his spring. The conviction in her voice struck him like a physical blow. Silas stared at her, his golden eyes cracking open wider, the primal beast inside his chest, howling in sheer awe at the strength of the woman sitting before him. She was battered, exhausted, and wearing a torn underslip, yet she commanded the room with the effortless authority of a true, undisputed sovereign. He slowly stood up. His massive frame dominated the chamber, casting a long shadow across the bed. He took one deliberate step closer, stopping exactly at the edge of the mattress, ensuring he did not trap her. "Your former pack is dead to you," Silas stated. It was not a question, but a confirmation of the law he was about to lay down. "The Dawn Court is a memory that no longer serves me," Seraphina corrected smoothly, her chin lifting slightly. "I hold no mantle. I wear no ring. I have nothing to offer you, Emperor Thorn, save for my presence. If you intend to use me as a political hostage against Vayne Ashwood, you will find my ransom is entirely worthless to him." A dark, dangerous smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth. It was a lethal expression, one that promised ruin to his enemies, but it was directed at her with pure, burning reverence. "I do not take hostages, Seraphina," he rasped, his voice dropping an octave, the sound wrapping around her like a physical caress. "And I do not care about the politics of a dying pack of fools who were too blind to see the sun sitting in their own throne room." He slowly reached out, his movements heavily telegraphed, giving her every opportunity to flinch or pull away. When she remained perfectly still, he gently rested his large, calloused hand flat against the mattress beside her hip. The physical proximity sent a jolt of raw, molten heat rushing up her spine. "You crossed my borders, seeking an end," Silas continued, his molten gold eyes locking on to hers, burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "But what I am offering you is a beginning. You are not a prisoner here. You are not a pawn to be traded, or a tool to be leveraged." He leaned down, bringing his face level with hers, the scent of cedar and ozone completely enveloping her senses. "Not used, not owned, chosen," he whispered, the words echoing with the finality of a blood oath. "I am offering you formal asylum within the Obsidian Empire. You will be granted the full protection of my armies, the resources of my fortress, and the complete, unyielding devotion of my soul. No man from that treacherous pack will ever take a single breath within 100 miles of you again. This is my vow." Seraphina stared at the lethal sovereign of the North. She searched his face for any trace of deception, any hint of the arrogant manipulation she had suffered for 5 long years. She found nothing but raw, devastating honesty. He was a monster to the world, but in the quiet of this freezing chamber, he was laying his entire kingdom at her feet without demanding a single thing in return. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean, cold air fill her lungs. For the first time in her life, she was entirely in control of her own destiny. "I accept your asylum, Emperor," Seraphina said softly, her voice carrying the undeniable ring of true authority. The moment the words left her lips, her heart rate steadied, a profound, unshakable sense of safety settling deep into her bones. The dormant magic inside her blood, finally given permission to exist without suppression, flared to life with a brilliant, invisible pulse. The reaction was instantaneous. Behind Silas, the thick layers of ancient frost coating, the chamber's massive window panes began to hiss. The ice immediately melted into clear water, dripping rapidly onto the stone sills. Down in the colossal courtyard of the fortress, a place that had not seen a single ray of warmth in 300 years, the eternal permafrost cracked. The dark stone beneath the ice began to steam, the ambient temperature of the entire keep rising rapidly. From a tiny fissure in the frozen cobblestones directly below the Emperor's window, a single impossible green vine sprouted, curling upward toward the light. Silas did not look out the window. He did not care about the impossible thaw of his cursed empire. He only looked at the woman sitting in his bed, watching the color return to her cheeks, knowing with utter certainty that he would burn the rest of the world to ash before he ever let her go. Vane's domain was no longer a kingdom of eternal spring. It was a sprawling, suffocating mausoleum of arrogant mistakes. 3 months had passed since the night of the vernal equinox, and the apocalyptic blizzard that had swallowed the territory showed absolutely no signs of breaking. The night of the ceremony, the sacred equinox torch had extinguished completely the moment Vane placed it in Lyra's hands. That single, terrifying failure had triggered an immediate, unnatural freeze across the Dawn Court, a catastrophic drop in temperature that destroyed all the season's crops in a matter of hours. The lush, emerald valleys that had once been the envy of the southern hemisphere were buried under 6 feet of hard, unyielding pack ice. The ancient riverbeds, which had flowed with warm, crystal-clear water for generations, were frozen so solid that the heavy supply wagons of the Royal Army could be driven directly over their surface without hearing a single crack. But there were no supplies left to transport. At the center of the frosted courtyard, beneath a sky choked with heavy grey clouds, the desperate remnants of the nobility gathered around the sacred sunstone, the massive slab of white marble, traditionally warm to the touch, was now encased in a thick shell of black frost. The air was so violently cold that the breath of the assembled wolves materialized as thick, ragged plumes of white smoke hanging heavy in the dead wind. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their bodies shivering uncontrollably beneath layers of stolen furs and hastily patched cloaks. They were waiting for a miracle. They were waiting for the woman who had replaced their true Luna to prove her worth. Lyra stood before the frozen altar. The fragile mistress, who had once worn her spun silver gown with such triumphant pride, was now drowning in a massive, heavy bearskin coat that threatened to swallow her delicate frame entirely. Her porcelain skin was mottled with angry red patches of severe frostbite, and her lips carried a sickly, undeniable tinge of blue. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the ceremonial silver dagger. By the ancient laws of the pack, if the equinox torch failed, the reigning Luna could forcefully awaken the dormant soil by offering a tithe of her own blood to the sunstone. It was a brutal, primitive rite, one that demanded pure, unfiltered magical resonance. Behind her, standing on the elevated steps of the keep, Vane watched the pathetic display with a heavy, sickening dread settling in the pit of his stomach. The Alpha King was clad in his thickest battle armor, yet the abyssal chill of the dying territory seemed to bypass the leather and steel entirely, sinking directly into his marrow. The mate bond void in his chest, the empty cavern where Seraphina's golden thread had once rested, throbbed with a persistent, agonizing phantom ache. "Proceed," Vane commanded, his voice hoarse, entirely stripped of its usual booming arrogance. The sound barely carried over the howling wind, but it was enough to make the shivering woman flinch. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, a tear escaping her lashes and freezing instantly against her cheek. She raised the silver blade and dragged the sharp edge across the palm of her left hand. She let out a sharp, pathetic whimper, her knees buckling slightly as a line of crimson welled up from the shallow cut. Desperate to maintain her stolen position, she lunged forward and slammed her bleeding palm flat against the frozen surface of the white marble altar. The entire courtyard held its collective breath. They waited for the familiar, comforting hum of ancient magic. They waited for the black frost to recede, for the stone to glow with the ambient heat of a true sovereign's blessing, for the snow beneath their boots to melt into fertile black soil. Nothing happened. There was no spark. There was no magical resonance. The thick layer of ice coating the sunstone simply absorbed the physical heat of her blood, freezing the crimson liquid into a dark, ugly smear against the white marble. Lyra gasped, pulling her hand back in horror. The wound had instantly crystallized, the freezing air biting directly into her open flesh. She cradled her hand to her chest, sobbing openly now, her facade of delicate perfection completely shattering under the weight of her catastrophic inadequacies. A low, terrifying murmur rippled through the gathered nobility. It was not a sound of pity. It was the primal, dangerous grumble of a starving pack, realizing that their leaders had doomed them to a frozen death. Garrick stepped forward from the shadows of the stone pillars. The old priest looked like a walking corpse, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by months of rationing and despair. He did not look at the sobbing woman at the altar. He looked directly up at the Alpha King. "The earth does not recognize her, my king," the priest rasped, his voice echoing with the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "There is no solar lineage in her veins. Her blood is just water to the stone. The seasonal rites have failed completely." Vayne did not answer. He couldn't. A suffocating, paralyzing humiliation clawed its way up his throat. He turned his back on the weeping Omega, on the frozen altar, and on the judging eyes of his starving people. He walked back into the obsidian keep, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind him, cutting off the sounds of the dying courtyard. The interior of the fortress offered no sanctuary. The grand braziers that lined the halls were completely empty, the stone walls radiating a damp, oppressive chill. Vayne bypassed his personal chambers and marched directly into the subterranean war room, a secure bunker where the last of the kingdom's administrative efforts were being managed. The heavy oak table in the center of the room was covered in a chaotic mess of unfurled maps, scouting reports, and thick, leather-bound accounting ledgers. The master of coin, a balding beta wolf with trembling hands, was frantically running a piece of charcoal down a long column of numbers. He froze the moment the arrogant sovereign entered the room, his face draining of whatever pale color it had left. "Assure me the northern hunting parties have returned with meat," Vayne demanded, bracing his armored hands against the edge of the frozen table. "Swear to me we have enough to survive until I can force the border passes open." The steward swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He slowly pushed the largest, heaviest ledger across the wooden surface. The parchment scraped against the frost with a sound like grinding teeth. "The hunting parties found nothing, my king." The wildlife fled the territory the moment the solar ward shattered, the older man whispered, refusing to meet his ruler's stormy grey eyes. "But the meat is not our primary concern. It is the thermal fuel. We are entirely out of black pine coal." Vayne's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. The phantom ache in his chest flared, a sharp reminder of his escalating failures. That is impossible. The southern sector silos were stocked with 3,000 tons of reserve fuel before the equinox. I saw the manifests myself. That was enough to heat the lower cities of the pack for 6 months. The steward's trembling hand reached out, his soot-stained finger, tapping a specific, meticulously recorded entry near the bottom of the open page. Vayne looked down. He stared at the ink. The numbers were undeniable, a damning column of arithmetic that spelled out the execution of his people. He traced the rough parchment with a numb, bruised fingertip. The entire emergency reserve of the southern sector had been liquidated. Gone, erased from the kingdom's holdings. "Sold," the steward clarified, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and suppressed rage. "To the river merchants from the eastern coast, 12 days before the equinox ceremony." "Who authorized this?" Vayne snarled, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating growl. His alpha aura flared, a useless, aggressive display of dominance that rattled the empty inkwells on the table, but provided absolutely no warmth. Who dared to empty the royal silos without my royal seal? Lord Moonbrook, my king, the steward answered, taking a desperate step backward to escape the crushing pressure of the king's fury. The father of your chosen partner. He used the access tokens you provided his family when you elevated her status. He sold the entire kingdom's survival reserve to foreign merchants, and used the gold to purchase the spun silver gown she wore to the bonding ceremony, alongside massive bribes to the outer nobility to ensure they supported her ascension. The heavy leather-bound ledger hit the frozen oak table with a sound like a cracking bone as Vane slammed his fist down. The impact splintered the wood, but Vane did not feel the pain in his knuckles. The realization hit him with the force of a physical avalanche. He hadn't just lost a true mate. He hadn't just driven away the only woman capable of maintaining the territorial magic. He had been completely, utterly played. He had traded the absolute, quiet devotion of a sovereign who bled for his people in silence for a family of greedy, manipulative parasites who had actively sold the kingdom's lifeblood to buy a pretty dress and stroke their own vanity. His chest heaved, his stormy eyes widening as the horrific scope of his blindness finally came into sharp, agonizing focus. The bitter, freezing air of the war room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. He had built his entire identity on the belief that he was an infallible ruler, a man who could bend destiny and magic to his will. Now, standing in the freezing dark of his own castle, Vane Ashwood realized he was nothing but a fool who had burned his own house down because he wanted to play with stolen fire. Far to the north, separated from the dying southern lands by an impenetrable wall of jagged mountains and lethal blizzards, the atmosphere was a profound, sensory opposite. Deep beneath the glacial fortress of the Obsidian Empire, far below the permafrost, and the howling winds of the surface, a different kind of awakening was taking place. The subterranean vaults of the Emperor's Keep were a marvel of ancient, forgotten architecture. The cavern was vast enough to swallow a cathedral, its colossal pillars of raw, unpolished black glass stretching upward into the darkness, supporting a ceiling lost in the shadows. Carved into the smooth obsidian floor was a massive, intricate network of deep trenches, the ancient thermal grid of the Northern Kings, long dead and dry. Seraphina walked slowly through the center of the massive cavern, her soft leather boots making no sound against the glass floor. She was no longer wearing the torn, freezing underslip of a disgraced exile. She was dressed in the tailored, functional garments of the Northern Court: deep charcoal trousers, a fitted tunic of breathable dark wool, and a heavy cloak of shadow wolf fur draped elegantly over her shoulders. The bruising on her wrists had faded entirely. Her silver-white hair was braided back with striking precision, and her amber eyes glowed with a steady, unshakable clarity. Walking exactly one pace behind her, a towering, silent guardian in the dark, was Silas. The lethal sovereign of the North wore no armor down here in the deep earth. He was dressed in a simple black tunic that stretched tightly across his broad chest, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The golden thread connecting his soul to the true Luna did not merely pulse, it sang. It was a heavy, intoxicating vibration that resonated in his teeth and settled deep into the marrow of his bones. He maintained a perfectly respectful physical distance, a green flag protector who refused to crowd her, but his sheer physical mass acted as an impenetrable shield against the dark. "My people are warriors, born to survive in the absolute extremes of the world," Silas explained, his deep, gravelly voice echoing softly off the glass pillars. "For 3 centuries, the Obsidian Empire has relied entirely on hunting the megafauna of the tundra and extreme rationing to survive the deep winters. We have never possessed the ability to cultivate the earth. The permafrost is too deep, the climate too hostile. He stepped forward, guiding her toward the very center of the subterranean chamber. A massive circular dais of raised obsidian sat in the middle of the empty trench network. It was the central nexus of the ancient geothermal grid, a piece of engineering that had been useless since the dawn of their recorded history. When I offered you asylum, Seraphina, I did not do it to acquire a trophy to sit silently in my tower, the Emperor continued, stopping at the edge of the dais. He turned to face her, his radiant gaze locking onto hers with a burning, absolute sincerity. You possess a mind for infrastructure that kept a dying kingdom alive for 5 years. You possess a magic that the rest of the world has forgotten how to revere. I do not want you to hide your light anymore. He reached into the inner pocket of his dark tunic and withdrew a heavy, intricate object. It was a solid block of dark iron, stamped with the fearsome crest of the Shadow Wolf. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was not a ceremonial necklace designed to mark her as property. It was the imperial seal of engineering. I am officially appointing you as the Grand Architect of the Obsidian Empire, Silas stated, his tone carrying the formal, unyielding weight of absolute law. You have complete, unrestricted creative control over the subterranean infrastructure of this territory. No general, no priest, and no council member will ever have the authority to question your designs. You answer to no one. You are the master of this earth. Seraphina stared at the heavy iron seal in his extended hand. For 5 years, she had been treated as a convenient battery, a silent battery whose ancient magic was drained to prop up the ego of an arrogant Alpha King who never once bothered to understand how hard she worked. Vayne had thrown a velvet mantle over her shoulders to hide her efforts, demanding she smile and look pretty while he took the credit for the blooming crops. Silas Thorne, the man the world called a monster, was doing the exact opposite. He was stripping away the useless pageantry and handing her the raw, unmitigated power to shape his entire empire. He was recognizing her competence. He was validating her intellect. She reached out and took the heavy iron seal. The metal was warm from his skin. Her fingers brushed against his broad palm, and a jolt of radiant liquid heat rushed up her arm, settling directly into her chest. She did not lower her head. She did not offer a submissive curtsy. She looked the most dangerous man alive, straight in the eye, and nodded once. A gesture of absolute mutual respect between equals. "Show me the nexus, Silas," she said softly, her voice carrying the undeniable ring of a sovereign stepping into her true power. The Emperor's breath hitched slightly at the sound of his given name on her lips. A dark, devastating smile touched the corner of his mouth as he stepped back, offering her an unobstructed path to the central obsidian dais. Seraphina walked up the short flight of glass steps. She stood at the absolute center of the massive, dark cavern. She closed her eyes, taking a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy, silent atmosphere of the subterranean vault fill her lungs. She did not have to force the magic. She did not have to suppress it to keep from outshining a fragile male ego. Here, protected by the absolute devotion of a true mate, she simply let the dam break. She knelt, placing both of her bare hands flat against the cold, smooth surface of the obsidian nexus. The activation of her dormant ancient magic was not a violent explosion. It was a profound, unstoppable awakening. A blinding, radiant wave of liquid gold erupted from her palms, sinking directly into the black glass. The dark stone instantly changed color, turning a deep, glowing amber as the extreme thermal energy surged through the ancient rock. The heat hit the empty trenches like a tidal wave. Silas watched in absolute awe as the intricate network of deep carvings lining the cavern floor suddenly ignited with rushing, molten light. The geothermal conduits, dormant for hundreds of years, violently drank the solar energy, carrying the blistering warmth outward in a massive expanding web. The temperature inside the colossal vault skyrocketed, shifting from the biting chill of a crypt to the heavy, humid embrace of a midsummer afternoon in a matter of seconds. The air filled with the sharp, beautiful scent of ozone, evaporating water, and the deep, rich smell of warm earth. Then the true miracle began. The walls of the subterranean agricultural chambers, previously completely barren, reacted to the sudden infusion of true, unfiltered solar magic. From the tiny crevices in the heated stone, bioluminescent fungi began to bloom, massive clusters of glowing blue and green life that cast a beautiful, ethereal light across the cavern. Vines thicker than a man's arm burst from the rich soil that had been meticulously packed into the designated growing beds, spiraling upward toward the glass ceiling at a terrifying, miraculous speed. The sheer biological force of her solar lineage, unleashed without restraint, began to cultivate a lush, impossible paradise deep beneath the frozen tundra. The air grew thick with the scent of blooming night jasmine and the sweet, heavy promise of rapid harvest. Serafina slowly opened her eyes and stood up, the golden light of the activated grid reflecting perfectly in her amber gaze. She looked around the massive, glowing cavern, her chest heaving slightly from the exertion, but a profound, overwhelming joy radiated from her soul. She had not just survived the winter, she had brought the sun to the darkest corner of the world. She turned to look down at the man standing at the base of the dais. Silas was staring up at her, the harsh, lethal lines of his face completely softened by a look of unadulterated reverence. He wasn't looking at the glowing vines. He wasn't looking at the miraculous crops that would save his people from starvation for the next 1,000 years. He was only looking at her. The primal beast inside his chest was purring, a deep, resonant vibration that echoed through their shared golden thread, an endless loop of adoration and protective fury. He walked up the glass steps, stopping just inches away from her. The ambient heat radiating from her skin mixed with the deep electric cold of his own aura, creating a perfect balanced storm of sensory perfection. He slowly reached out, his massive hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs brushing carefully over her cheekbones. "They threw away a goddess," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, violent emotion that he refused to hide from her. His burning amber gaze darkened, the lethal sovereign bleeding back into his expression as he thought of the men who had caused her pain. "I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen to you ever again." Serafina leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as the profound, unshakable safety of his vow washed over her. The hollow ache of her past was gone, completely overwritten by the burning, brilliant reality of a future she was finally building with her own 2 hands. The Eastern realm was freezing in the dark, suffocating on the ashes of their own arrogance, but deep beneath the ice, the true Luna had finally found her empire. The wind howled outside the thick glass doors of the Emperor's private chambers. It was a vicious, biting gale that had historically kept the Obsidian Empire locked in an eternal, punishing winter, freezing the blood of any man foolish enough to wander beyond the stone walls. But inside the sanctuary of Silas's rooms, the air was thick, heavy, and saturated with an impossible radiating warmth. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing a sky choked with centuries of frost, but the cold could not penetrate the ancient warding Silas had erected around her. Serafina stood near the massive stone hearth, though she no longer needed the fire. The blistering heat was radiating entirely from Silas. He stood before her, a towering monument of lethal grace and restrained power. His molten gold eyes tracked her every micro-expression. He was a predator, an apex sovereign built for violence, yet his massive hands, when they reached out to gently cup the sides of her face, were devastatingly tender. They trembled. The emperor of the most feared territory in the realm was trembling before her. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips like a sacred vow. Silas let out a low, ragged breath. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, resonating deep within the marrow of her bones. He stepped fully into her space, his massive frame blocking out the flickering light of the hearth, eclipsing everything but his absolute devotion. His rough thumbs traced the delicate line of her jaw, mapping the faint scars left behind by years of neglect. He did not push her. He did not issue a command. He simply waited, a terrifying king offering his bare neck to a quiet queen. The mate bond between them hummed with frantic energy. It was a live wire of physical anticipation, a river of liquid silver rushing beneath her skin, demanding completion. She remembered the exact moment her previous world had shattered. The grand hall, the expectant faces, the sheer, unadulterated humiliation when Vane's eyes had passed over her as if she were completely invisible. Seraphina had not cried. She had not begged. She had kept her head bowed and her spine straight, accepting the public rejection with a terrifyingly quiet dignity. But inside, her soul had been bleeding. For years, she had contorted herself to fit into Vane's narrow, suffocating expectations. She had dimmed her own light so as not to outshine his fragile ego. She had believed, in her darkest, most vulnerable moments, that she was inherently unworthy of being truly seen. But looking at Silas now, standing in the heart of a frozen empire that he had brutally conquered to ensure his own survival, she finally realized the truth. She hadn't been unworthy. She had simply been offering a masterpiece to a blind man. Silas didn't want her to dim her light. He wanted her to burn down the entire sky. "Are you certain?" Silas rasped. His voice dropped to a feral growl, a primal sound torn from the very depths of his soul. "Once the mark is placed, there is no undoing it. You will be bound to me, to this empire, to the ice and the dark." Seraphina didn't hesitate. She didn't shrink back from his intensity. She was stepping into the light as a true equal, fully embracing her own destiny. She tilted her head to the side, willingly exposing the delicate, pulsing line of her throat. "Mark me," she breathed, her voice steady and resolute. "Take what is yours." Silas's fangs descended, grazing the highly sensitive skin over her mating gland. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the deep, intoxicating scent of night jasmine and sun-warmed earth that belonged solely to her. And then he bit down, pain, a sharp, brilliant flash of pain that lasted less than a fraction of a second, instantly consumed by a rushing, gold-white heat that flooded her veins like molten starlight. The bond snapped into place like a heavy iron key, turning in an ancient lock. Seraphina gasped, her fingers digging desperately into the hard, rigid muscles of his back as her knees buckled. It was not just a tether. It was a cosmic explosion, a massive, echoing detonation of soul and magic that reverberated through her entire biological system. The invisible golden thread that had hovered between their consciousness suddenly solidified into a heavy, unbreakable chain of brilliant, radiant light. Her heart hammered against her ribs, syncing perfectly, flawlessly, with the deep, thundering rhythm of his own pulse. Her ancient, dormant Sunforge magic, the power she had suppressed for years beneath the stifling, oppressive shadow of her former kingdom, finally broke free. It did not just awaken, it erupted. A shockwave of pure, molten heat blasted outward from where their bodies pressed together. It shattered the thick frost on the glass of the balcony doors. It ripped through the dense, black stone walls of the obsidian keep. It cascaded down the towering spires, pouring into the frozen courtyards below like a tidal wave of liquid gold. The raw, staggering force of her magic sought out the deepest, coldest corners of the fortress, eradicating centuries of embedded frost in a single heartbeat. Silas pulled back, his eyes wide and wild, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she was pouring into his veins. His glacial skin flushed with unprecedented warmth. The phantom aches of his own brutal past, the deep, hollow scars of his violent ascension, were instantly flooded with her pure light. Some wounds could only be healed with love. Outside the bedchamber, the physical transformation of the Empire was catastrophic in its breathtaking beauty. The thick permafrost that had locked the territory in ice for over a century began to violently crack. A deafening series of fractures echoed across the valleys as massive, jagged glaciers splintered and dissolved into rushing, vital rivers. The heavy, suffocating snow completely evaporated into a warm, glittering mist that hung over the city. The jagged summits of the northern mountains, previously lethal and unforgiving, were suddenly bathed in a brilliant, cascading alpenglow. Beneath the suddenly thawing soil, ancient seeds that had laid dormant and presumed dead for generations burst open. Within seconds, thick green vines crawled up the black stone pillars of the fortress, their emerald leaves unfurling with violent speed. Crimson and gold flowers bloomed across the training grounds, their delicate petals drinking in the sudden, blinding sunlight that pierced through the eternally grey clouds above. Down in the muddy courtyards, the elite sentinels, hardened warriors bred exclusively for brutal, freezing warfare, dropped their heavy iron weapons. They fell to their knees in the wet dirt, staring at their bare hands, openly weeping as the warm sun hit their scarred faces for the very first time in their lives. The crushing winter was over. The true Luna had found her rightful empire, and the earth itself was singing in absolute submission to her presence. Silas collapsed to his knees, pulling Seraphina down with him. The Emperor of Ash and Bone, a man who had slaughtered entire rebel armies without blinking, buried his face in the soft fabric of her gown, his massive shoulders shaking uncontrollably. He pressed reverent kisses to her hands, worshipping her with a desperation that bordered on religious fervor. "Mine," he whispered, the word thundering through their newly forged bond like a steady war drum. "Yours," she promised, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. "Safe. Unconditionally, eternally safe." 300 miles away, the realm of spring was dying. The temperature had not simply dropped. It had plummeted into an unnatural, lethal abyss of sub-zero agony. The sky above Vane Ashwood's once prosperous kingdom was a suffocating blanket of dark charcoal grey, completely blocking out the sun. The wind shrieked through the empty cobblestone streets like a wounded animal, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke, sheer desperation, and the unmistakable, metallic scent of frozen blood. Vane stood on the grand balcony of his palace, shivering uncontrollably. He wore 3 layers of thick, heavy furs, yet the unnatural cold bit straight into his bones, sinking deep into his marrow. His knuckles were tinged a sickly blue, his lips were chapped, cracked, and actively bleeding with every shallow, agonizing breath he took. But the severe physical agony of frostbite was nothing compared to the hollow, agonizing void rotting in the center of his chest. The mate bond was gone. The exact moment Seraphina had accepted Silas's bite, the frayed, neglected thread connecting her to Vane had severed completely. It had felt like a brutal physical amputation without anesthetic. Vane had collapsed in the center of the cavernous room, vomiting bile as his inner wolf howled in sheer, unadulterated agony, a primal scream of catastrophic loss. He watched her leave like a man, watching his own heart walk out of his chest. But in his blinding, suffocating arrogance, he hadn't realized the magnitude of his fatal mistake until the warmth had followed her out the gates. Behind him, In the dead center of the grand hall, the equinox torch stood on its marble pedestal. It was completely dead. Not a single spark of magic remained, just a charred, useless piece of dead wood. When he had publicly bypassed Seraphina and handed the sacred artifact to Lyra Moonbrook, he had arrogantly expected the seasonal fires to ignite, to bring forth the bountiful spring harvest. Instead, Lyra's touch had extinguished it permanently. The false Luna possessed no magic, no intrinsic value to the earth. She was a hollow, empty vessel, clothed in manipulative silk. And now, his kingdom was starving because of his monumental stupidity. The massive oak doors to the balcony creaked open, the sound scraping against the frozen hinges. Vane didn't bother to turn around. "What is it, Garrick?" he snapped, his voice raspy and weak, a pathetic echo of the booming, authoritative tone he had once commanded. Garrick Ironclaw stepped onto the icy stone. The priest looked terrible. His face was entirely gaunt, the pale skin stretched tight over his sharp cheekbones. His eyes were wide with a primal terror he could no longer suppress. He kept his spine bowed into defeat, clutching a frozen parchment in his violently trembling hands. "Alpha King," Garrick rasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The reports from the lower city, the riots have finally broken through the southern barricades. The people, they are breaking into the royal grain silos. But there is nothing left. The crops in the eastern valleys died completely overnight. The roots are black with frost. The livestock are freezing solid in the fields. We have less than 2 weeks of rations remaining before mass starvation takes the entire pack." Silence stretched over the frozen balcony. "And Lyra?" Vane asked, the name tasting like bitter ash on his bleeding tongue. "She has locked herself in the western wing," Garrick replied quietly, his tone laced with poorly concealed disgust. "She claims the cold is making her ill. She is demanding the guards bring her more firewood, even as the pups in the lower rings freeze to death in their beds. She refuses to see anyone, my king. She says she is not responsible for the weather." A sudden, violent rage surged through Vane's emaciated frame. He spun around, grabbing the heavy stone balustrade to keep himself upright. "Let her freeze. Let them all freeze," he roared, though the shrieking wind instantly snatched the pathetic words away. He began to pace like a trapped, rabid beast, his amber eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely erratic. His heavy boots crunched against the layer of ice that had formed over the intricate mosaic tiles. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. Vane's ego was a towering, impenetrable fortress that completely refused to acknowledge reality. He could not be wrong. The Alpha King of the Dawn Court did not make mistakes. He had chosen Lyra because she was pliant, because she constantly stroked his pride, because she didn't possess that quiet, unnerving, independent strength that Seraphina always carried. He had wanted submission, not a true partner. But Seraphina was gone, and with her went the sun. "It is Silas Thorne," Vane snarled, his logic twisting into a grotesque, highly delusional knot. "The Emperor of the Northern Wastes. He stole her. That savage kidnapped my Luna." Garrick blinked, staring at Vane as if the Alpha King had completely lost his mind. "My king." Seraphina walked out of the gates on her own. "We all saw it. You publicly stripped her of her title. You handed the Equinox torch to another. She dropped the Dawn Court mantle and left willingly." "Lies!" Vane lunged forward, grabbing the frail priest by the collar of his heavy robes, lifting him onto his toes. "She is a creature of the Dawn Court. Her magic belongs to this land, to me. She wouldn't leave unless she was manipulated. She is acting out. She wants me to chase her. She wants to prove her worth, and that bastard Thorne is using her as a political hostage to cripple my kingdom." Vane released Garrick roughly, shoving the older man back against the heavy wooden doors. He began to pace again, a frantic, unhinged energy taking over his starving frame. He completely refused to believe she was happy. He violently refused to believe that the sudden, miraculous warmth that had bloomed over the mountains of the Obsidian Empire, a phenomenon his frozen scouts had reported with terrified awe just hours ago, was a result of her freely choosing another mate. "She thinks she can hide behind his brutal armies," Vayne muttered, pacing faster, his breath plumbing in a thick white cloud. "She thinks I will just roll over and die. No, I am the Alpha King. Her magic is bound to my crown." Garrick rubbed his bruised throat, his eyes filled with profound pity and absolute terror. "What are you proposing, Vayne? We have no military might left to fight. The soldiers are starving to death. If we march on the Obsidian Empire, Emperor Thorn will slaughter us before we even reach the borders." "We will not march for war," Vayne said, stopping abruptly. A cold, arrogant smile slowly stretched across his bleeding lips. It was a terrifying expression of pure, unfiltered delusion. "We will march for diplomacy. We will prepare an envoy. Gather the remaining royal guard. Bring our royal seals. I will ride to the Obsidian borders myself. You intend to demand her back?" Garrick breathed, thoroughly horrified. "From Silas Thorn? I intend to take back exactly what belongs to me," Vayne corrected smoothly, aggressively adjusting his heavy furs as if he were preparing to attend a grand diplomatic ball rather than a desperate, doomed trek through the lethal ice. "Silas is a brute, a feral savage from the frozen wastes. Once I present the legal bound of our prior mating and the ancient council laws, he will have absolutely no choice but to hand her over to avoid breaking the peace. And when I bring her back, she will grovel for my forgiveness. She will beg me on her knees to restore her place." He looked out over the freezing, starving expanse of his once glorious empire. He heard the distant, agonizing screams of his dying people, but the horrifying sounds didn't register in his mind as a reflection of his own failure. They registered entirely as her betrayal. "Prepare the horses, Garrick," Vayne commanded, turning his back on the trembling priest and staring out into the suffocating blizzard. "We leave by midnight. I am going to remind my runaway Luna who her true master is." The northern frozen peaks were not meant for the arrogant. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard tore at them like the claws of a starving beast, shredding the delusion of Vayne Ashwood's supremacy with every howling gust of wind. The journey that was meant to be a righteous march of retrieval had devolved into a grueling, pathetic crawl through a frozen hell. The cold was not merely a weather condition. It was a physical predator. It stalked them through the narrow, treacherous mountain passes, sinking its icy fangs into the unprotected gaps of their armor. Day one had completely stripped Vayne of his fury. The wind had ripped across the glacial valleys, burying the marked trails under 6 feet of solid snow. He had forced his massive warhorse forward, the beast's every breath a rattling, agonizing wheeze in the sub-zero air. Ice had quickly coated Vayne's once gleaming armor, turning the heavy steel into a frigid, inescapable cage that leached the core heat directly from his bones. By day 2, his lips were severely cracked and bleeding, the warm blood freezing onto his chin in grotesque ruby icicles before he could even raise a stiff hand to wipe it away. His fingers, clamped numbly around the leather reins, had entirely lost all sensation. He knew, with a creeping sense of primal dread, that the flesh beneath his heavy gauntlets was turning a dangerous, bruised shade of violet. Every painful step the horses took sounded like breaking glass as their hooves shattered the frozen drifts. Behind him, Garrick Ironclaw rode in a hunched, silent stupor. The priest had not spoken a single word since they crossed the absolute border of the dying Dawn Court. He didn't need to. The silence itself was an absolute, suffocating accusations that pressed down heavily on Vayne's lungs. Every time the wind screamed through the barren, skeletal trees, It sounded exactly like the dying wails of their people. The lower cities of the kingdom were already completely entombed in merciless ice. The crops had turned to black ash in the fields beneath the snow. The livestock had frozen standing up in their pens, and Lyra Moonbrook, the woman Vane had chosen to elevate before the kingdom, the fraud who possessed absolutely no true magic, was currently hiding in her royal chambers, weeping helplessly as the last pitiful embers of the kingdom's warmth sputtered and died. Vane's mind, however, violently refused to break under the crushing weight of his own monumental failure. It spun with toxic, desperate justifications as he spurred his dying horse forward on the dawn of the third day. She was his. The ancient council laws strictly decreed it. The mating bond, though violently rejected on the night of the equinox, was a legal tether that no sovereign on this continent could simply ignore. Emperor Silas Thorne was a brute, a bloodthirsty warlord of the frozen north, but even he would not risk a massive continental war over a runaway female. Vane clung desperately to this arrogant belief as the frostbite gnawed brutally at his cheeks. When he demanded her immediate return, Seraphina would finally realize the catastrophic error of her temper tantrum. She would see the extreme, life-threatening lengths he had personally gone to in order to retrieve her. She would fall to her knees in the snow, weep bitterly for his forgiveness, and return to save his starving people. Because begging was what Omegas did. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome of his absolute authority. Begging was what she owed him. He didn't know that the concept of starvation was about to be completely redefined. He didn't know that the magic he had thrown away into the ashes had found a far richer soil to bloom in. And he definitely didn't know that Silas Thorne didn't care about continental war. The transition between the frozen wastes and the Empire was not gradual. It happened in the span of a single, jarring heartbeat. One moment, Vane and Garrick were fighting blindly through a solid wall of white-out snow, their eyes squeezed tightly shut against the vicious ice pellets tearing at their corneas. The next, their horses broke violently through an invisible, shimmering barrier of ancient ward magic. The blizzard stopped instantly, cut off as though sliced by a blade. The air that hit Vane's face was not merely warm. It was a physical wall of heat, thick with the intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine, damp earth, and crackling ozone. He gasped, his frozen lungs burning violently as they expanded to take in the rich, heavy, summer-like air. The sky above was a stunning canvas of deep twilight, entirely devoid of snow clouds, brilliantly illuminated by bioluminescent flora that draped the towering black spires of the imperial fortress in the distance. Before Vane could even process the impossible, vibrant bloom of the supposedly frozen northern kingdom, his horse let out a final, agonizing shriek. The absolute shock of the sudden temperature shift, combined with 3 brutal days of starvation and physical exhaustion, was simply too much for the creature's heart. The beast's knees buckled. It collapsed heavily, sending Vane sprawling headfirst into the soft, lush green grass. Garrick's horse followed a fraction of a second later, entirely dead before its heavy body even hit the dirt. Vane scrambled frantically to his feet, his frozen joints screaming in protest, the sudden warmth making his frost-bitten nerves ignite with agonizing, blinding pain. He brushed the dirt from his armor, frantically trying to summon the oppressive, dominant aura of an Alpha King. But as he looked up, the shadows of the ancient tree line separated. 4 massive lichen guards stepped smoothly into the warm, golden glow of the forest. They were absolute monsters, easily standing over 7 feet tall. They wore heavy armor forged of black steel, their eyes glowing with a primal, terrifying intensity that made Vane's inner wolf immediately cower in the darkest corner of his mind. They did not bow, they did not kneel. They looked at Vayne not as a visiting, respected monarch, but as a rabid, pathetic stray dog that had foolishly wandered onto a sacred battlefield. "I am Vayne Ashwood, Alpha King of the Dawn Court," Vayne rasped, his voice sounding incredibly thin, reedy and pitifully weak, even to his own ears. He reached for the heavy hilt of his broadsword with trembling fingers. "I demand a formal audience with Emperor Thorn. I have come for my—" Before the word could even leave his tongue, the captain of the guard moved. It was a terrifying blur of pure, lethal violence. A heavy, gauntleted hand clamped securely around Vayne's throat, effortlessly lifting him an entire inch off the ground, while another hand casually stripped the broadsword from his hip and tossed it carelessly into the dirt like a child's broken toy. Garrick fell to his knees in instant, weeping submission behind him, babbling aloud in abject terror. "You are a trespasser in the sanctuary of the true Luna." The guard captain snarled, his voice a deep, reverberating rumble that literally shook the ground beneath Vayne's dangling feet. "You will be brought before the Emperor and his chosen mate. If you speak out of turn, I will personally pull your tongue from your skull." Vayne was dropped unceremoniously to the grass. He lay there, gasping desperately for air, the phantom pain of the iron grip still searing his bruised neck. He was hauled roughly to his feet, entirely disarmed, publicly humiliated, and dragged relentlessly toward the imposing black spires of the central palace. The long walk through the palace grounds was a refined, calculated psychological torture. Vayne had confidently expected a grim, icy stronghold, a perfect reflection of the ruthless Silas Thorn's bloody reputation. Instead, he found an absolute, breathtaking paradise. Waterfalls of liquid silver cascaded smoothly down massive walls of polished obsidian, bioluminescent vines carrying the unmistakable, radiant warmth of pure solar magic, pulsed with a soft, golden light, winding intricately around ancient stone pillars. The air literally vibrated with absolute prosperity and joy. The Obsidian Empire wasn't just surviving the devastating winter. It was thriving on a magnificent, explosive scale Vayne's territory had never achieved in its entire, heavily documented history. And Vayne knew exactly whose dormant magic was feeding the land. The undeniable realization tasted like bile in the back of his throat. The heavy doors of the imperial throne room stood ominously at the end of a long, vaulted corridor. They were carved from dark stone that looked like winter itself, black and imposing. As the towering guards shoved Vayne and Garrick forward, the massive doors exploded inward with a deafening sound like the end of the world. The room was vast, an absolute architectural masterpiece of black glass and molten light. But Vayne's eyes did not register the towering columns or the intricate, swirling floor mosaics. They locked immediately onto the raised dais at the far end of the grand hall. Emperor Silas Thorn sat upon a throne of jagged obsidian. He radiated an aura of pure, suffocating lethality. He did not need to stand or shout to command the immense room. His mere physical presence was a crushing weight that pressed down violently on Vayne's chest, making it nearly impossible to draw a full breath. Silas's eyes, a dangerous storm-glass grey, locked onto Vayne with the terrifying, motionless calm of an apex predator watching a dying prey bleed out. But it was the throne beside Silas that shattered Vayne's reality into a million jagged pieces. Seraphina. She did not look like the quiet, submissive Luna who had always kept her head bowed and her spine straight to appease his fragile, demanding ego. She wore no heavy velvet cloak of submission. She was draped in a breathtaking, backless gown of midnight silk and woven silver, designed specifically to highlight the fierce, untamed power radiating from her glowing skin. Her hair cascaded down her back like liquid starlight, entirely unbound and wild, and her eyes, once a soft, hopeful hazel, now blazed with the molten amber fire of fully awakened ancient magic. She was a goddess of warmth and absolute ruin, and on the crook of her neck, stark and completely undeniable against her pale skin, was the deep, permanent, jagged scar of a claiming bite. The word thundered through the echoes of their severed bond like a war drum. Mine. But the bond did not belong to Vayne. It belonged entirely to the terrifying monster sitting beside her. Vayne's knees finally threatened to buckle. He had travelled through ice and death to demand obedience. He had arrogantly come to graciously offer his forgiveness. But looking at her now, feeling the overwhelming, suffocating power of Silas's domain that she had single-handedly awakened with her sheer presence, the absolute truth hit him like a physical blow to the sternum. He had not discarded a weak, wolfless Omega. He had thrown away the sun itself. Seraphina, Vayne breathed, his voice cracking horribly, the name echoing pitifully in the massive, silent chamber. What have you done? Silas shifted slightly on his dark throne. The physical temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in a single, terrifying second, the shadows lengthening around the Emperor as his inner beast flared in pure, protective fury. A name unspoken for 6 months grows teeth, beggar. Silas's voice was a low, vibrating growl that rattled deep in Vayne's molars. Address my sovereign mate with respect, or I will personally let my wolves use your bones for kindling. Before Silas could rise from his seat to execute the brutal threat, Seraphina reached out. She placed a single, delicate hand on Silas's thick forearm. The Emperor's lethal, freezing aura vanished instantly, miraculously replaced by a profound, reverent calm. The monster of the north, the warlord, who had slaughtered thousands on the battlefield, leaned into her gentle touch like a dying man, seeing water after wandering a barren desert. She didn't know she held the absolute power to calm the storm, but Silas knew. He watched her flawless profile with a devotion so absolute, so entirely consuming, it made Vayne physically sick to his stomach. Seraphina stood. The rich silk of her gown whispered against the polished stone as she gracefully descended the first 2 steps of the dais, looking down at Vayne. There was no lingering anger in her blazing amber eyes. There was no sorrow. There was no trace of the woman who had once desperately sought his approval. There was only the cold, detached pity one might reserve for a dying, insignificant insect. "You brought the cold to my gates, Vayne," Seraphina said, her voice echoing with the heavy, undeniable resonance of ancient solar magic. "Why are you here? I came for you." Vayne blurted out, stepping desperately forward, completely ignoring the Lycan guards who instantly leveled their heavy, iron-tipped spears squarely at his chest. "I came to bring you home. Our home is freezing. Seraphina. The crops are dead under the snow. The people are actively starving in the streets. Lyra, she lied to me. Her rights failed entirely." The equinox torch burned to ash in her hands. "I was blinded by a curse, by her dark manipulation. I didn't know." "Lie," Seraphina interrupted him, a single word slicing through his pathetic, weeping excuses like a sharp blade through silk. "There was no curse, Vayne. There was only your massive ego. You chose a woman who flattered your pride over the mate who bled in silence for your kingdom. You broke the sacred covenant of the land, Vayne Ashwood. The winter burying the Dawn Court is not a curse. It is the direct, unchangeable consequence of your own staggering arrogance." Vayne fell hard to his knees. The polished black stone floor was brutally unforgiving, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the agony actively ripping through his chest. He was the Alpha King. He was supposed to be invincible, revered, completely untouched by consequence. But begging wouldn't have changed the outcome on the night of the equinox, and it definitely wouldn't change it now. Yet, as he looked at the sheer, terrifying power radiating from her, he had no other choice left. "Please," Vayne wept openly, the hot tears carving clean, desperate tracks through the grime and dark frostbite on his face. He pressed his forehead directly against the freezing floor in absolute subjugation. "I will banish her. I will strip Lyra of her title, her pack standing, everything she owns. I will rebuild the sacred altar with my bare hands. I will give you the crown. I will give you the entire kingdom. Just come back to me. I am your true mate by law, the ancient council laws." "The council laws mean absolutely nothing in the Obsidian Empire," Silas interrupted, his deep voice laced with dark, dangerous amusement. "I am not your mate," Seraphina said softly, her voice holding the absolute, terrifying finality of a closing grave. She reached up, her long fingers delicately grazing the claiming mark on her neck. "I am a sovereign recognized for my true worth, no longer a pawn you can exploit." She turned slightly, gesturing gracefully to a massive, dark oak table, positioned at the very edge of the dais. On it rested a single heavy parchment, practically vibrating with restrictive dark magic. Next to it was an inkwell that smelled distinctly of heavy iron and copper. Blood ink. "You have absolutely nothing left to offer me, Vayne," Seraphina stated firmly, stepping aside to reveal the binding document. "But because I will not let the innocent people of the Eastern Valleys starve to death for the sins of their foolish alpha, my mate and I have prepared a legal arrangement." Garrick, who had been weeping silently on the floor near the towering doorway, suddenly scrambled forward on his hands and knees to look at the parchment from afar. He gasped, his hollow face turning a sickly, terrifying shade of grey. "My king, it is the vassal state treaty. It is absolute, irreversible subjugation." Vayne stared up in utter horror. The brutal terms of the treaty demanded the complete, unconditional surrender of the Southern Kingdom. The border walls would be entirely dismantled. The Alpha King's title would be permanently dissolved, reducing him to a mere regional steward under the absolute, unquestionable command of the Obsidian Throne. All resources, all pack laws, all remaining military might would be surrendered directly to Silas and Seraphina. "You would steal my kingdom?" Vayne choked out, a fresh wave of tears spilling over his frostbitten cheeks as he looked at the woman he had once publicly deemed entirely unworthy of a crown. "You lost your kingdom the very moment you let the Dawn Court mantle fall into the ashes," Seraphina replied, her voice entirely devoid of mercy or hesitation. "Executu, the treaty in blood, Vayne. Bind your name to it right now, and our imperial supply lines will reach your freezing borders by dawn to feed your starving people. Refuse, and you can ride back into the northern frozen peaks to die with them." Vayne looked desperately at Silas. The Emperor merely smiled, a terrifying, lethal flash of white teeth that promised a slow, exceptionally agonizing death if Vayne chose to fight. He looked back at Seraphina, searching frantically for a single flicker of the devoted girl who used to love him. There was nothing, just the blazing, untouchable heat of a true sovereign. His hands shook uncontrollably as he crawled pathetically toward the oak table. He picked up the quill. It felt infinitely heavier than his broadsword, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. He pressed the sharp nib into the heavy parchment. The blood ink hissed loudly, violently sealing the ancient magic into the fibers. As he shakily provided his signature, a violent, tearing shockwave erupted through his chest. The pack bond, the alpha spark that had defined his entire existence, was violently and permanently severed. The magical tether that connected him to the earth, and his people snapped like a brittle twig. He gasped, collapsing onto his side on the cold stone, clutching his chest as the magic brutally stripped him of his sovereignty. He was no longer a king. He was nothing. He lay there broken, and even as the magic stripped him, a distant, heavy rumbling echoed from the courtyard outside. The massive, iron-reinforced wagons of the Imperial Guard were already mobilizing. Thousands of pounds of fresh grain, cured meats, and enchanted firewood were beginning their march toward the starving territory. The innocent people would survive, but they would survive under her banner, completely erasing his legacy from history. Seraphina looked down at the broken, weeping man on her floor. She reached down, her elegant fingers delicately grasping the edges of her midnight silk gown. With perfect, flawless precision, she executed a deep, formal curtsy. It was the exact same curtsy she had given him on the night of her brutal public humiliation. But this time, it was not an acceptance of defeat. It was the final, echoing nail in his coffin. She rose smoothly, turned her back on him, and walked steadily toward the jagged obsidian throne. She never looked back. "Remove him from my sight," Silas commanded, standing to pull his mate securely into his side. The guards dragged the weeping, broken steward out of the grand throne room by his arms. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, sealing with a booming echo that sounded exactly like the end of a world. Silence descended upon the chamber, heavy, warm, and absolute. Seraphina let out a long, slow breath, feeling the last lingering shadow of her painful past dissolve into absolute nothingness. The cold ache in her chest, a phantom wound she had carried silently for 6 months, was finally permanently gone. Silas turned to her, his terrifying, lethal aura melting away entirely. He gently cupped her face, his large, rough thumbs sweeping tenderly across her cheekbones. His storm-glass grey eyes were entirely focused on her, studying her intensely for any sign of lingering distress. "Are you all right, my heart?" he murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble of pure, undeniable comfort. "I am," she whispered, leaning heavily into his touch, the radiating warmth of his skin completely grounding her. "It's truly over." Silas didn't just hold her, he worshipped her. Slowly, reverently, he lowered his massive frame to one knee before her on the dais. The most dangerous, lethal man on the continent pressed his forehead gently against her stomach, wrapping his powerful arms securely around her waist. Through the mate bond, a river of liquid silver warmth pulsed steadily between them, completely unbreakable, and beneath the quiet, powerful hum of their intertwined magic, if one listened closely enough, there was another sound, a rapid, tiny, secondary heartbeat fluttering softly against Silas's cheek. The true heir to the magic and the Northern Throne safely cocooned in absolute, terrifying protection. Seraphina rested her hand affectionately on Silas's dark hair, looking up toward the high, sweeping windows of the throne room. Outside, the bioluminescent flowers of the palace grounds bloomed even brighter, sensing the profound, unshakable peace of their Luna. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy in the face of absolute public betrayal. She would never step aside again. She was the light in the dark, the warmth in the winter, and she was exactly where she was destined to be. Thank you for listening to this story. Some wounds can only be healed with a love that demands nothing less than absolute devotion. If you enjoyed Seraphina's journey from a silent, rejected mate to an undisputed, fiercely protected sovereign, let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did the former Alpha King grovel enough for your absolute satisfaction when the treaty was finalized? Your thoughts mean more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories of quiet strength, karmic retribution, and the unbreakable power of true mates, make sure to subscribe and join our sanctuary. Until next time, stay warm and never forget your true worth.